Hello. Hello everyone. I'm Rudranaran Das. Welcome to you to this World Human Sciences and Management Conference, Invitation to Global Dialogue on Agnotological Context, Disciplinary Practices of Social Sciences and Policy Frames, organized by Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha, Dialogues and Dialogue. My heartfelt thanks to Professor Mahadev Jaiswal, Director, Indian Institute of Management, Sambalpur, and Professor I. Ramabrahma, terminate and author and educationist, Professor Sarat Kumar Palik. Dear friends, the convener of this international forum is Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, eminent historian representing the prestigious institution of Odisha, Ravenshaw University. And another convener of our international gathering is Mr. Charudatta Panigrahi, who guided us for this event also. Friends, in today's lecture, we have with us Professor Dr. Alex M. Thomas from Azim Premji University, Bengaluru, and former tutor from Sydney University, Australia. Will speak on history of economic thought and its perpetual relevance. We are very happy to host you, Professor Alex. Now, without wasting much time, I would like to invite the convener of this international forum, Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, to go for his introductory remark on this webinar. Over to you, Professor Nanda.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah,
yes,
can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Great welcome to all the viewers, and particularly our major attraction of this session, Dr. Alex Thomas. Hearty welcome, Thomas. As rightly pointed out in the introductory note, that this is a great journey that we have started embarking on with this Center for Adivasi Research Development in association with Indian Institute of Management and Central University, Koraput, have come up with a very interesting idea of thinking through some of the major issues that confront us, that confronts the humanity today, and as part of what we have spelled out as a kind of invitation to dialogue on a global scale, where we'll be discussing varied areas, varied issues concerning the humanity. And for that, in that connection, we have series of speakers that are likely to come up in the whole year. Perhaps it looks like this. It's a tall order. And we started with a very interesting theme last time when we discussed about climate and energy policies. And today we have a very distinguished speaker, Dr. Alex with us. He's a great economist, he's a young economist teaching in Azim Premji, Bangalore. And his recent book, Macroeconomics and Introduction, has been recently published by CUP, one of the very prestigious publishers of the world, Cambridge University Press. And as I can figure out, because I'm a student of a very different area, like history, contemporary history, but the way we have been looking at economics is very strange because of our connection with doing economic history to a certain extent as part of getting trained in historical theories. What really is striking with Alex is that he talks of a very huge talks of a very huge. I mean, this work basically tries to illuminate a long trajectory of thoughts, economic history of economic thoughts, that has the way it has evolved, and particularly brings in a kind of alternative approach to understanding macroeconomics, which is very important. And he tries to put it in the context of Indian milieu. So within the context of Indian ecology, he tries to see the evolving dynamics of perhaps, I haven't gone through that work, and I'm looking forward to his enlightening talk. and the way he's trying to, problematize the alternative discourse, that is interesting in his, perhaps in his work. Of course, as he tries to tell us that starting with whether it is Smith or Ricardo to Marx to any one contemporary economic philosophers, that he's trying to look at, think through these, the way they have thought about microeconomics, and tries to seek a kind of relevant paradigm for the functionality aspect of it, and this is what is really makes his work very interesting. But in another way of looking at it, what he calls that mainstream marginalist macroeconomics, that is where I think he makes a very strong departure to the understanding of macroeconomics in general, to my mind. I think this is where he's going to tell us, how this margin in the context of understanding macroeconomics is to be related, is to be understood. That is what will make the talk would be more challenging. And this is again related to his alternative ways of conceptualizing macroeconomics, as I can look forward to. But having said this, I'll close with two quick comments, then we can come back after the very enlightening talk that we're going to hear from Alex. Is that, just to put it on the floor, Alex is absolutely great in terms of his understanding of economics. He has to teach us. Two things that very quickly comes to mind for people, those who are not specialists in economics, but in other, they're some kind of domain specialist in other areas of social science. The two books that has really hit the market and the minds is that one is, of course, Tirthankar Rai's Economic History of India, which came up in 2000. And the other book is Kenneth Pomenard's The Great Divergence, where he talks about China, Japan, Europe, and the making of this modern economy. So, and this Kenneth's book is very interesting that as it has been flagged off by saying that, can there be a moment in understanding economic history where we can all understand political economy as post-colonial, or can political economy be post-colonial? That is a kind of question which has been recently been voiced for the last couple of years, in the last few decades rather, when social scientists really get drawn to the ideas of post-colonial criticism. And because as this work would try to showcase that Europe remains at the center of our understanding of economics, whether it's macro or microeconomics, whether there can be a decentering of Europe while understanding economics, or the kind of models that Europe has set, or capitalism, the way it has been thought through as a kind of idea which emanated with its stadial growth, with its stagist growth from Europe, and then dominated the rest part of the globe, is the only way, or this is the only model that we have to follow. And this Great Divergence tries to bring out a different story to it altogether. So I am conceptually drawn to these two books, where I'll try to juxtapose one is at one level, a very famous book which has really hit the market and mind, like Alex one, and the way Alex would like to, take on these two books, the way, because it has come recently. So because these two books have come in 2000. So how does he connect the, kind of discursive journey of these two books with his own book? Thank you, Alex, for agreeing to join us. And I'm looking forward to this talk. We come back to more of discussion after you close. Thank you very much. Again, just a minute, I would like to also very profusely thank Bikram Jena, the director of, the Center for CARD, or Center for Development Adivasi Research, for at least making this show possible. to bring in the finest minds of the world because of sheer energy and sheer commitment that he has made it possible. So thanks a lot, Bikram, for taking up this great initiative. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Nanda. Now I'd like to request Professor Alex to start his talk. Over to Professor Alex.
Thank you so much, Dr. Das and Professor Nanda. And especially my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Bikram Jaina for actually inviting me and, providing me with the support. And also a special thanks to Center for Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha, along with IIM Sambalpur and Central University. And Professor Nanda's comments about economic history, I will come back to during the course of the presentation a little bit, and also at the end, and we can take it up in questions. So when Dr. Jaina actually invited me to the talk, I did think about, what is my expertise and what can I share with all of you and have a discussion about. So I thought I'll talk about the history of economic thought, but pitched at a social science audience. So it's not a very specific talk. So let me just share my slides. So at the very beginning, I want to make a distinction between history of economic thought and economic history. And I will talk a little bit more about it towards the end. So history of economic thought, the way I'm conceptualizing it here is as a history of ideas, as a history of concepts, as a history of theory. Whereas economic history looks at more the context in which these theories might evolve, or the political and the economic context as such. But there is a link between ideas and how we understand what context might emerge. I'll come to that a bit later. And I'm really hoping, and I really like the theme of the entire sessions that you've organized, because it's mainly about idea, debate, dialogue. And I think that's what is really necessary. And I think this platform has given us that opportunity, and I'm really grateful for that. So this is the way in which I'm going to talk or present this lecture today. I'll explain a little bit about the nature of economics itself, make some remarks about the link between how we understand the past and the present, or the present and the past. Again, talk a little bit about the nature of economic ideas. I'll give you some examples of how history of economic thought is actually done, which will connect to some of the points that I'm making initially. And then I'll make some concluding remarks. So to begin with, the nature of economics itself. One is this, and Professor Nanda already mentioned this, the idea of mainstream economics. And what do I mean by that? The usual way in which we describe mainstream economics is to call it neoclassical economics. And I'm not going to use the word neoclassical in this presentation, although I will put it on the slide. I'll tell you the reason a little bit later. It is primarily marginalist economics. It is an economics which makes use of notions of marginal utility, marginal revenue, marginal cost, marginal product. And this is what underlies the demand and supply curves in most textbooks, and that we see what we talk about. The other important characteristics of mainstream economics today is the dominant use of quantitative techniques, particularly econometrics, in making sense of our economic surroundings. So there's been a large move towards a quantitative kind of understanding. The other aspect which might differ in some respects with other social sciences is also a kind of professionalization or a kind of Americanization that has happened to the academic discipline of economics. Earlier, there were different models of how one could do economics, but increasingly it has become uniform. One of the ways in which this has happened is through the university ranking systems, which I think is not a very healthy idea, but it creates a kind of standardization where all of us have to do certain things to be in that top ranking. Another way in which it is done is through journal rankings. So if you work on history of economic thought, your journal will never be in the top rank because the mainstream of the economics profession does not value that. So, but an econometric journal can be in the top. If you work in marginalist economics, your journal, your article can be at the top. So there is a certain way in which journal rankings have also contributed to this. And as a consequence, this decides what kind of research people want to carry out. This decides what kind of funding or what kind of projects are funded. And of course, this also decides promotions because of journal rankings. But then this has a kind of a trickle down effect, which is that often the PhD topics are now based on what can get funding and what is popular and what can be published in the top journals. And in some cases, maybe not in all cases, but this also has an impact in what kind of ideas are taught to our students. So all this is in a way connected together, and I think I'll come back to it towards the end. The other aspect of economics, which I think makes it different from other social sciences, is the proximity to policy making and the way in which quantitative techniques or quantitative assessments are made and its proximity towards that. But this has always been the case, even as far back as David Ricardo, when he's writing, he's also, he was a member of the parliament and he was actively involved in making policy suggestions. The other kind of change that has happened is this change in nomenclature. When Adam Smith, Ricardo, Marx, they were writing, they were writing in what is called political economy, where there was a recognition that economics and aspect of politics or power were fused together. But with the rise of utilitarianism, they wanted to get away from the social science aspect of economics, to call it, and move towards something more like physics. And in that process, they changed the name from political economy to economics. And this is a significant change which we need to be alerted about. But then in the recent past, in the 2008 global financial crisis, when economics, the mainstream of economics failed to either predict it or to even have a proper explanation of it, it moved to, again, people now started saying that they're not working on economics, but they're working on political economy. So today, there are many people who use the word political economy, but they might be using it not necessarily in the way I think of political economy that is found in the work of Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. A question of economics, I believe, cannot really be separated from questions of ethics. What does it mean to have a good life for all? It cannot be separate from the question of, or the understanding of history, whether what is the history of the caste system or what does colonialism mean for us. It cannot be separate from the question of politics too, because it is, after all, politics is some combination of our understanding of ethics in some sense. In economics, very often a distinction is made between positive economics and normative economics. The way in which it is defined is positive economics is what is out there and what is that can be observed, and normative economics is what ought to be. And many students, when they study microeconomics, mainstream marginalist microeconomics, it is told to them that what we are teaching you is positive economics. So what ought to be is somewhat seen separately. But the question to anybody who's a who's a social science student or even a political economy student, it is clear that what ought to be always influences what is. After all, it is yesterday we decided how the world should be organized today, and today we are studying it. So this kind of a distinction, that is clear distinction between what is and what ought to be, needs to be challenged. And to put it in this way, that economics is a political subject, because after all, we are talking about how these resources can be shared and what kind of resources to be produced, which is fundamentally a matter of politics. Now, moving on, let me just introduce you to different schools of thought, which will make this lecture also most meaningful. To begin with, the mainstream school of thought, which is the marginalist school of thought. As I mentioned to you earlier, it uses terms like marginal product, marginal revenue, marginal utility, and it builds the demand and supply approach. And some of the people who are most famous and associated with this school of thought is Jevons, Walras, Marshall, and Samuelson. When I talk about classical economics, I have in mind economists, already Professor Nanda mentioned some of them. I'll just add one more name to it. So apart from Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, Piero Sraffa, an economist who was writing in the 1900s and especially in the 1950s, 1960s, he revived classical economics by going back and studying their texts. So Sraffa also falls within this classical tradition. There are other schools of thought which have their own paradigm and have their own ways of understanding the world, and I'm just mentioning some of it here. Marxian economics, Keynesian economics, Austrian economics. So Austrian economics, which draws from the work of Hayek, von Mises, etc. And when it comes to the history of economics, and this is where I'm going to make a connection with economic history a little bit. One way to do history of economics, and this is the way, I mean, my own work in this area is to look at the history of ideas and look at the history of theories. But there are other ways of doing history of economics, and some people focus on the context in which these ideas emerge and to try and see what is the link between these contexts and how they have led to the creation of particular ideas. But in my own work and in the presentation today, I'm not going to be focusing on that. I'm going to talk more about the history of ideas or the history of theories by keeping aside that question for now. Moving on, what is the kind of link between past and present? And this is a question that I still try to grapple with and try and make sense of. How do we really understand the past? And in the process, I have accumulated some of these quotations, which I feel illuminate this issue at hand. And one is this quote from actually George Orwell from his 1984 book, or the book 1984. Who controls the past controls the future. And I think this is extremely central. And I think because there are many historians in this audience, I'm sure that I don't need to mention this anymore. And who controls the present controls the past. So this sort of dialectic or this connection between past and present is an important thing to keep in mind. And what kind of ideas have been presented? What do they mean? How have they been used are also central to our future. The other quotation, which is more popular, at least among economists, is from Keynes's 1936 work, The General Theory. Practical people who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. So very often people have some kind of a rejection towards theories and ideas, but ultimately, when they make recommendations or practical recommendations, you might be able to make some connection with that suggestion and an economic idea. Then the question arises, okay, there is some sort of a link between the past and present, but how do we present the past? So one way of thinking about it, and one way in which economists particularly have done this, is to think of the past as some kind of an inferior version of the present. And this is very clear, especially in many textbooks. And they talk about Adam Smith only to say that, he was in the past, and whatever is good, we have already taken, and whatever is bad in his work, we have rejected. And what this kind of a presentation in textbooks, in books, in media, it conveys that intellectual progress is in some way linear. As if we are able to take what is good and discard what is bad without understanding the power or the politics of knowledge production. So often, even in history of economic thought, ideas are presented in a chronological manner. So Ricardo is seen as an advance over Smith. So what I mean is this, that some people might think that Marx is an advance over Ricardo and Smith. So therefore, it is enough if we read Marx. we don't need to read Smith and Ricardo. Or there are also groups of people who think that it is adequate to read Alfred Marshall because he has taken what is good in Jevons, what is good in Ricardo, and we don't need to read the others. And more, maybe in the 1900s, etc., people can think that it is enough to read Samuelson because he has taken what is good in Smith and what is good in Marshall. Or even today, people can think there is no reason to read Smith or Samuelson because Solow has made these advances, and it is sufficient to read Solow. And my thesis or my argument here is that all these are wrong ways of understanding ideas, and we should not just read Marx, we should go back and read other texts. We should not just read Solow, we should read other texts. Because intellectual progress in economics or in other areas do not happen in a linear or chronological manner. Then the question is, okay, why are these people irrelevant today? Why should we study, or why should we understand Smith, Ricardo, or Marx? Because they were writing in a different century, but what is the relevance today? One can ask the question, are these texts outdated? Because today we want to know what is happening today and how are these relevant today. But then my response to those kinds of questions is, I'm not able to see how we can put a timestamp or an expiry date on ideas, whether it has been written in the 1600s or the 1500s or 1800s, anytime. And in a way, I think of ideas as always being alive. But that does not, of course, mean that I'm arguing that these can directly be applied anywhere and everywhere in a universal sense. But the ideas themselves, what did they mean? What did they say? I think are always alive. And my submission, therefore, is that all ideas are valuable. Now, let me move on to the nature of economic ideas and how do people understand it? The dominant way of looking at economic ideas or economics itself is that there is only a single way. There is a single paradigm, or there's a single way of understanding our surroundings. And this is the idea that is embedded in mainstream economics. There are people within mainstream economics who adopt it and say that, okay, let's try to have an alternative way of understanding it. But the alternative is often by some kind of a synthesis. So you take some ideas from Marx, you take some ideas from Marshall, and you try to fuse it together. Or it could be you want to mix Keynes and Hayek together. And that's one way of going about it. My own preference is not to do it this way. My own preference is to engage with contending paradigms. And this is what heterodox economics or non-mainstream economics tries to do. And there are many paradigms here, as I mentioned earlier. So it could be Austrian economics, it could be Keynesian economics, Marxian economics, or classical economics. And there are alternatives here. So in a way, what I'm calling for in opposition to pluralism by synthesis is pluralism by antithesis, where we want to understand what are the differences between Marx and Marshall. There might be similarities, but we want to understand them separately. And only if we understand them really separately, might we realize that it's really impossible to actually synthesize them. Similarly, Keynes and Hayek. There is a fundamental distinction between their worldviews and their fundamental economic concepts. So we have to treat them differently. And my own preference for doing it, is the contending paradigm approach. And that's what I've also done in my own work. So let me just briefly take you through the schools of thought. I've mentioned some of this before. What most people across the world are taught as economics is mainstream marginalist economics, which uses the supply and demand schedules. The question to ask is supply and demand schedule the only way of understanding prices? And the answer is no. There are other ways of understanding it, but this is what is conventionally used everywhere. So this is what is there in textbook economics. This is what expands to other areas of thinking about it. They also use a certain kind of quantity theory of money, which has a role to play in how inflation is understood, how monetary policy is carried out. Another important feature of mainstream economics is its commitment to methodological individualism, where it believes that we can study economic societies by looking at it through the lens of an individual. And then the macroeconomy is an aggregate of these individuals. In opposition to this, classical economics understands value and distribution, or prices and distribution together. It is not separate. And in this context, it also highlights the aspect of power. It highlights the fact that capitalists have more power than workers, the notion of social classes. And classical economics therefore adopts a different kind of methodological standpoint, what is called one of holism, because it starts from social classes and an understanding of structural power. Now, there are other schools of thought, which I won't get into today. It could be Marxian political economy, feminist political economy, institutional economics, Austrian economics. All of them have different ways of understanding some of these core ideas. And let me just come back. Let me just make one comment here. So if I feel that if one is an economic historian trying to understand how prices in the past have evolved, if you are trained in marginalist economics, one is going to try and use a supply and demand framework to understand prices. But if one is trained in classical economics or political economy, you're going to have a different way of understanding how prices have evolved. So it's in this sense that I say that history of economic thought or economic ideas have an impact on how economic history is actually done. Moving on to the dominant ideas, and I think this is important because what ideas are shared, what ideas get disseminated. And this is a quote from the German ideology, which says that the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. And this also goes back to the initial slide where I spoke about journal rankings, about university rankings, and what goes into our curriculum and syllabi. I think that this is a question that we need to ask. Where are these ideas coming from? Who is disseminating these dominant ideas? Now, the link between, I briefly mentioned the role in policy making, and here I want to connect it with economic thought. One, there is a very direct link, as many of you would have realized by now, which is that because the dominant paradigm is being taught through universities, after that, when people go on to do policy making, it directly influences what they do. And this is in the form of syllabi and textbooks. But it could also be indirect, more in the way of what Keynes spoke about, practical people, that this dominant paradigm in universities, in intellectual settings, also have an influence on dominant modes of thinking. So many people will think in terms of demand and supply schedules. But this is primarily because of a certain kind of mainstream way of looking at, or the marginalist way of looking at our economic surroundings. And in fact, what I tried to, this article in EPW, what I tried to do was this, to try and look at what does the policy document, like an economic survey, do? What is the underlying paradigm that I can find in the economic survey document? And what I find, not very surprisingly, is that it adopts it adopts a supply side growth theory, which is a marginalist growth theory or a mainstream growth theory. And in my article, what I tried to do is I provide a critique of that by pointing out the fallacies or the issues with thinking like that. And I proposed an alternative, which is in the classical political economy tradition and the Keynesian tradition, which is called demand-led growth theory. So in some sense, it is pluralism by antithesis, where I juxtapose supply-side growth theory with demand-led growth theory and try to argue that what are the benefits of for policy making for adopting a demand-led growth theory. Let me make some comments on the nature of criticism and what is it that we're trying to do. Mainstream economics has critics. There are people who criticize mainstream marginalist economics. And I've tried to give a sort of a way of how to think about it in this EPW article as well. So there are internal critics of mainstream economics. People like Amartya Sen, Joseph Stiglitz, Paul Krugman, all of them have political differences with mainstream economics, but all of them primarily use the tools within mainstream economics. So broadly, methodological individualism and other kinds of demand and supply tools that are used by mainstream economics. There are other kinds of critics external to mainstream economics or marginalist economics, people like Karl Marx, Piero Sraffa, and Krishna Bharadwaj, I mentioned because she was at JNU, and late Krishna Bharadwaj. She was influenced by the work of Piero Sraffa, and she also works in the classical political economy tradition and tried to provide a criticism of mainstream marginalist economics. And we also have criticisms of economics which come from people outside the discipline of economics, such as sociologists, anthropologists, ecologists. And all these are important, but what history of economic thought and the study of history of ideas and theories actually provide us with is a framework to recognize this. It provides a framework. We can place Amartya Sen as an internal critic of marginalist economics. And we also understand how these might be put together and have a framework for making sense of criticism itself. Now, what I'll do is I'll try to give you two examples from the history of economic thought and how some of the themes that I've spoken about are engaged with and how it actually, why it is relevant. In public domain and in probably academia, the dominant interpretation of this, what was called marginalist general equilibrium research program, where general equilibrium refers to equilibrium in all the markets that we are interested in, was that it was actually seen as a vindication of Adam Smith's invisible hand doctrine. This is the dominant idea. In newspapers, very often I come across how Adam Smith is seen as a proponent of the free market, a proponent of invisible hand. So in a way, the claim is that Adam Smith's vindication happens in General Competitive Analysis, this book that I put here by Arrow and Hahn. So you don't have to really go back and read Adam Smith because whatever is there has been demonstrated in this work. Again, a kind of linear way of looking at intellectual progress. And this, I just want to have this quote here because where it is written, Adam Smith's invisible hand is a poetic expression of the most fundamental of economic balance relations, the equalization of rates of return. And then later on, Smith also perceived the most important implication of general equilibrium theory, the ability of a competitive system to achieve an allocation of resources that is efficient in some sense. This is the dominant interpretation, and this, I think, is, it is very problematic. And let me just use a small example to indicate that. Now, this is a work done by historian of economic thought Tony Aspromorgos, and he has earlier worked on classical economics. And in 2009, he published a book on Adam Smith and the framing of political economy. In this recent work in 2020, which is published in the New Palgrave Dictionary of Economics, he tries to articulate what is Smith's invisible hand notion. And what he finds is that the notion of invisible hand is to be seen as a kind of unintended system level consequence. There are only 3 instances in the entire body of Adam Smith's work that he uses the term invisible hand. One is in this pamphlet called History of Astronomy. The other one is in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. And the third one is in the Wealth of Nations. In the Theory of Moral Sentiments, it doesn't really have much conceptual meaning. And what Aspromorgos characterizes it as a rhetorical overstatement. In the Wealth of Nations as well, it's not, the use of the term invisible hand is neither insightful nor compelling. But what can be, the sense that one can make of a careful study of these texts is that there is a recognition that competition has some kind of a positive impact on the society. That is all that we can say, and these are unintended in nature. And it is not like the free market argument that is made out to be, or it is not in that specific form in which Arrow and Hahn make it out to be. Now, what is the method through which we arrive at such a thing? One is by reading the entire Smith corpus. It has to be systematic, it has to be thorough, and there has to be evidence, textual evidence. There is also a contextual element. What is the link in Smith's own intellectual framework between invisible hand and science? What is the nature of capitalism at that time? And what is the context in which these arguments are being written? Because sometimes people quote from here and there, but without really getting the nature of the argument or the context in which these arguments are made. And the other kind of conceptual or the method that is there in History of Economic Thought and in this particular work is that he makes a distinction between classical economics and marginalist economics, and argues that Adam Smith's economics is distinct from that of marginalist economics, and therefore it cannot be seen as an inferior version of the supply and demand theories that are taught today. The second example, it's from a journal article which was published in 2019 by Irene Bertonet, where she looks at this question: is competition necessarily efficient? And this was published in the journal Review of Radical Political Economics. The economists that she covers, she studies Pareto, Allais, and Arrow and Hahn, the people I mentioned earlier. And in the case of Pareto, who's published Manual of Political Economy in early 1900s, he uses this term for, again, efficiency is a notion that economists use very often, policymakers use very often, general public uses very often. But there's a very specific history to it. There's a very specific meaning, at least in the way Pareto thinks of it, where he's thinking of maximum ophilimity for the collective or for the maximum collective. And in this quotation here, he argues that if there is some small displacement from the position, it means that it leads to a decrease in what others enjoy. So this is the idea of Pareto efficiency that which is there in economics today. But this for Pareto was actually a criterion within pure economics as in abstract economics in a model, in the sense of a model. So for Pareto, he argues that pure economics does not give a truly decisive criterion for choosing between an organization of society based on private property and a socialist organization. And further, he writes, this problem can be solved only by taking characteristics of the phenomena into account. So it is very clear here from Bertonet's work that Pareto recognizes that this notion of efficiency or Pareto efficiency cannot be blindly applied to actual economies. But what has subsequently happened? What has happened is they've changed the nomenclature from ophilimity to efficiency criterion. And this was partly done to diminish the normative nature, like what ought to be. So you don't want it to be what ought to be. We want to communicate that this is how markets are. This is what is. So optimality to efficiency was primarily in the work of these economists mentioned here, and to avoid ethical connotations. You want to try and reduce the what ought to be or the normative questions. And this was then subsequently, and even today, it is applied to evaluate economic policies. Most notable, this has been done, but there have been some objections to this from this body of work, which Amartya Sen has also contributed to, called welfare economics, where it says that it's not enough to look at efficiency, we have to look at other considerations. However, but even the question of efficiency at a very fundamental and conceptual level needs to be questioned. And this is what comes out of reading this History of Economic Thought work. Here I want to also alert you to, there is a large body of literature which talks about market failures within the mainstream economics, but the claim here is markets can fail sometimes, but they also claim that efficiency is valuable in and of itself. But the question to ask, and History of Economic Thought asks this question, is what does efficiency mean? what is the history of this concept? What is the intellectual context in which this idea has come up? And can this be applied? Can this be understood today? Or how differently can it be understood? And what we see is it was just a descriptor in Pareto. And now, unfortunately, and it is because of the dominance of mainstream economics or marginalist economics, it has moved to a policy aim. And this has now become applied to actual markets. And this idea of Pareto efficiency has been used by economists such as Arrow, Akerlof, Stiglitz to understand actual markets. And this is actually a quote from this book, Stiglitz, Walsh, and Lafay. So they argue that the benchmark that the perfect competition model provides is also useful for another reason. It helps us to understand the causes of poor market functioning when its basic assumptions are not verified. But the problem with this kind of an understanding is, what if the benchmark itself is problematic? What if the benchmark itself is faulty? What if we need to replace the benchmark? If we have a wrong benchmark, it means that our policy suggestions can be way off the mark. So now let me just draw upon some of the points that I've made and conclude. One, I think that in a way, history of economic thought also provides us with a guide to the future, because as I mentioned today, there is a dominance of econometrics. In the past, there were dominance of different kind of ideas, and here it is important that at least as an intellectual community, and especially for young students, to keep in mind that there's always an ebb and flow of ideas, and it's transient, and there are also fashions in academia that some things become popular today, but tomorrow they become unpopular. So it is important that history of economic thought is able to give a bird's eye view or a full picture of how these ebb and flows of ideas have taken place, and to also recognize that there are many different ways of doing economics. The other kind of problem, and this is also the question of relevance, sometimes the way we understand relevance is a very narrow understanding of what we think is important today to our concerns, and a kind of presentism, which I think cannot be entirely reliable, because we don't know how the future is going to be. And we also want to ensure that for the future generation, there is a large repertoire or a set of ideas that are available. So we cannot cling on to some narrow version of presentism. I also think that the history of economic thought provides a strong antidote to monism. Monism as opposition to pluralism. Monism seen as there's only one way of understanding our economic surroundings. And I would prefer history of economic thought which advocates pluralism by antithesis, which is that in theory, now the dominant school of thought is marginalist economics, but it should be, students and researchers should also be exposed to multiple ways of understanding around. So this could be classical economics, it could be feminist economics, it could be Marxian political economy. Even when it comes to the question of method in economics, it is dominated by a certain kind of quantitative technique. What is the role for ethnography? What is the role for oral history? What is the role for textual analysis? So there has to be a pluralism in method too. And there has to be a pluralism in the way in which we understand even the question of relevance. And I think history of economic thought provides us with that sensibility, where presentism is also a narrow way of understanding our surroundings. And one needs to understand relevance also in a much wider sense. And finally, this is the last slide before I move to the thank you slide. I think that history of economic thought, based on what I've tried to present to you, has a very critical function, because it gives us a framework to assess ideas, to scrutinize it, to outline the context in which these ideas are presented. It also helps us compare different ideas of economists. It identifies limitations, but it also helps us in generating new hypotheses where these ideas are always alive, where we try to bring it to bear on our own experience of living today. And we can also bring to it different kinds of empirics or quantitative understandings, And it's truly when all these three come together that we can say with some degree of confidence that we are actually able to make sense of our economic surroundings. And I'll just end by making a note. Thank you to Professor Nanda for drawing attention to my recent book, where I've tried to do some of this, where I've tried to present contending paradigms, and it's all situated in the Indian context. And in this earlier edited book, what we try to do is we try to show different contributions in this book are about different schools of thought. There are also 3-4 chapters on Indian economic history and Indian economic thought. And just to maybe end here, the question and to raise the question of how do we decenter Eurocentric models, what Professor Nanda had asked. The approach that I take in my recent work is not really to decenter it, I think. And what I think is important in understanding the structure of capitalism, whether it's the work of Smith or Marx, but it is clear that they cannot fully explain our contemporary surroundings. And to do that, to make sense of the experience, I draw on Indian fiction writers. And I also use publicly available data, which gives us broad orders of magnitude of the Indian economy. So in a way, to me, it's a coming together of these ideas which have originated from Western context. But when they come together with more indigenous ideas or ideas which are coming from the Indian subcontinent, I feel it provides us with a way of understanding our society, which is not necessarily a kind of decenter. And I think that there's a way in which they converse with each other, but it also points to the limitations and what Eurocentric theories can do and cannot do. And with that, I'll end here. Thank you so much to all of you for listening, and I look forward to the comments and questions.
Yes, thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Alex, for this talk. I don't know, where to begin from, but before we have these final words, and you are very brilliantly, related to the whole trajectory of thoughts, the way it has traversed a long way, starting with Adam Smith to Ricardo to Marx to the contemporary period. And you're right, when you said this, particularly I was drawn to that, that you are looking at the roots of these ideas, instead of, trying to, superpose Marx to other, the kind of people who preceded him, something like that. So that is very interesting. These days when we try to, look at the genealogy of, ideas, we can't simply, we cannot be dismissed of Kant or a Hegel, even though we say that Marx is important, or for that matter, any Mao is important, or for that matter, any Gandhi is important. So, and also drawn to this, again, to this question of decentering Europe, you said rightly that there has to be a kind of enriching conversation. That's perfectly true. But the way capital has been thought through by mainstream economics in terms of economic category only, instead of looking at the philosophical and historical aspect of it, that's what I was trying to, bring to the table. So thank you very much. But that's more important for that the questions that have come up in the screen itself. Starting with Bikram's very interesting question: how do you locate this mineral-based economy and the challenges coming from a kind of scenario where the mafia, the mining kind of, scenario, which always we encounter, but as political economists, we hardly have anything to suggest from our textbook, kind of things. So what do you say about that? And then there are following questions. You can have a quick look at it and sum up and tell us.
Yeah. So I'll take this question, Professor Jaina's question first. what is political economy of India, and the question of mining and material flow. So I have actually engaged a little bit with the question of land and the question of mining in my macroeconomics book. But I won't tell you the details of it, but I'll just take what I think my position on this is that the question of land is central. It is central to understand ownership of land and the history of land ownership. Why is it that some people own land and some people do not own land? So this is not something economic theory can provide an answer for. And this is something that history can provide an answer for. And we need to have conversations there. So therefore, my own position on economic recommendations is also much more limited, because sitting here in Bangalore, I do not know any context, let's say in Kerala or in Odisha, to be able to say this is what should be done. It has to be a decentralized decision that is being made with what the people want. Similarly, and it goes to, I think, Professor Nanda's question as well. What is our understanding of capital? What is our notion of progress? What is our notion of economic development? Does it always come in the way in which we have to repress agriculture? Agriculture should go down. We should move towards more services. There is no way in which any economic theory, I believe, should tell us what should be done. It has to be primarily a matter of collective decision making. What is it that we want should be done? And then Dr. Jain also makes mention of, I think, the ecological challenges. This is also something I deal with in my book. But again, it is very difficult to reduce everything to economic models. And in this context, my position is that to make sense of our surrounding and to advocate policy, it is not sufficient to just ask economists. So for instance, why is it that in our earlier planning commission or Niti Aayog or in the Reserve Bank, why is it that we don't have historians? Why is it that we don't have anthropologists? Why is it that we don't have sociologists? And I think for some kind of a policy making to understand our social surroundings, it is important that we all come together. And economics, I believe, can only contribute a little bit in that. So let me look at the next question. Agriculture economy can sustain a market policy through the model of liberalization of LPG is concerned. What is your ideas about the statement for Indian context and industrial economy? So as you can imagine, so my own work is really in the history of economic thought, and my own engagement with policy making is also from a conceptual standpoint. So even in the position I take in my book is I'm hesitant to make very specific policy proposals, because what is good for Odisha may not be good for Bangalore. So what is good for Nagaland may not be very good for Tamil Nadu. And because agriculture also is very differently undertaken, the people who are undertaking is different, the technologies are different. So it's very, I believe it's very difficult to have a kind of general policy recommendation on these questions. And so in a way, my answer to your question is I don't know. But what I do in my book is to provide a framework for thinking about it, and to say that to really get to the root of it, there is no substitute to understanding the local context. So let me take the next question. What is the primary reason that traditional economics cannot explain reality? Is it the lack of a realistic theory or the mistakes of traditional theory? So there are, let me try to answer it in two ways. One is that traditional theory, I think, suffers from logical conceptual issues. So that is one, which in a way means that if there is a logical inconsistency, it can be used to explain anything. So for instance, economists like Gary Becker, who have used the rational choice theory to explain marriages, how households work. So this cost-benefit analysis or the rational choice framework can be used to understand everything. And there have been economists who have written about the imperialism of economics, because these kinds of traditional marginalist notions have taken over other disciplines, and the same framework is being applied there. So in a way, it can be used to explain everything. But what the problem is, because of the logical inconsistency, it can be used to explain everything. Secondly, it does not really have a proper understanding of structure, of notions of power, which fundamentally any social sciences has to deal with. So, and then there are problems of assumptions. So in a way, traditional theory has been this successful because I believe, at least my own conjecture on this is because it is adaptable to any situation. You can bring in market imperfections, as I pointed out, and talk about unemployment. You can bring in asymmetry of information and talk about unemployment. So everything and anything can be accommodated, but it really fails to understand the essence of capitalism or the essence of the economic society that we live in. So there is a question on what is political economy. There are different definitions of political economy, but the definition that I use in my book, which I've taken from Adam Smith, is that it is ultimately a subject which tells us how all of us can have more of access to commodities and services, and also how we can enrich the government so that we have access to education, health, what we think is essential for a good life. The other aspect of political economy, the way in which I understand political economy, is that it recognizes structural power in our societies. But there is another way in which mainstream economists talk about political economy. They bring in economics, some rational choice notions to political parties or to the government. Or they say that political economy is just the fusion of politics and economics. But that's not the way in which I have tried to define it. And my definition is taken directly from the definition that we find in the work of Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. So there's a question on what is the impact of climate change and standard of life. Again, so I'm not an expert on this area at all, and I haven't worked on it, but the work that I shared, which was on Nordhaus, Nordhaus, an environmental economist who won the Nobel Prize. And what I provided was a criticism of his models because it comes from, again, a traditional marginalist framework. And the way in which they think about climate change and reducing it to marginalist economics is deeply problematic. And so it was in that context that I mentioned, and beyond that, I can't really answer. What can be done to develop the Indian economy? Now, this question, of course, I don't know the answer to, but I think, in my book too, this is what I do. I say that the government has to be committed to full employment. The government and we as a collective have to be committed to a good life for everyone. Now, a good life, people can have different views of a good life, but there should be enough decentralized institutions that ensure that our wishes are respected. And let me just give you an example. Now, from a growth theory point of view, or in general, one would think that having a road is a good idea because road leads to physical infrastructure, and maybe roads improve connectivity to hospitals, to schools. But if I'm laying that road through a forest, or if I'm laying that road through an agricultural farm, it is not an easy question to answer. And I don't think any amount of modeling can really answer that question. And here it has to be some kind of a democratic conversation. And so here I don't think economic models can help. What is my view on economic interpretation of history by Marx? So I've not really worked on this to be able to give an answer, but I'll just maybe make a related point, which is that Marx's criticism of Smith and Ricardo are valid in the sense that both Smith and Ricardo did not question or try to say that there are other ways of economic organization, or they didn't really question that. There's no real understanding of primitive accumulation in Smith or Ricardo. However, if you go back before Smith and Ricardo, and there's an economist by the name Richard Cantillon, who published his work in 1755, who's also a classical political economist, there is recognition of primitive accumulation in that. So I think that it is important to keep in mind that capitalism has a particular organizing principle. And I mean, since you asked this question, I've just started reading this book by Jairas Banaji on I think, commercial capitalism, where he is arguing that our traditional notion of thinking of capitalism as primarily industrial needs to be challenged, because historically you can find capitalism and the circulation of capital in commercial capitalism among merchants and in the exchange sphere. So I think this is also something we need to keep in mind, but I don't have a clearer answer than that. Thank you.
Yeah, Alex, if you're finished, just again coming back to this initial question that I flagged, a very quick thought on Tirthankar Rai's work, also Kenneth's work, particularly I look forward to a kind of work from you, particularly because you have a long years to go, long innings to play. How do you deal with this moment of post-colonial? Can political economy be post-colonial? I mean, that's the famous question which is being sounded in the academy today. How do you deal with that? That's
So I have not really thought about this, and I know some work by Tirthankar Roy, and I've read a little bit, but I haven't read The Great Divergence, or at least I don't recall it in the recent past. But the only comment that I can offer here is the way historians have studied economic growth is to use the dominant framework, say, and the example that I can give is that of technology. The conventional understanding is that technological progress leads to economic growth. But this is only one way of understanding technology. And this is what comes from marginalist growth theory. And this I challenge in my book to argue that technology cannot be understood in such a simple fashion. We need to really look into the black box of technology, and the effects of technology itself are context dependent. There is nothing like a universal improvement of technology, because one way of countering this is, suppose there is technological progress which leads to a lot of unemployment of labor. How is that economic growth? Because it leads to a decrease in incomes, decrease in aggregate demand, which can have a negative effect on growth. So when historians are trying to study or make sense of the past of an economic kind, it depends on what models they might choose from economics and economic theory, and whatever is dominant. So either you could have a very marginalist understanding, or one could take a more Marxian understanding. But in either context, we have to be careful of how these ideas are shaping up, and what kind of mental models, or what are the implicit models that historians are using to understand our past. And so I believe that if historians use a demand-led growth framework, the story that you can tell about the past would be different from what is there today, because they've primarily used a supply-side growth framework. Okay. And your question about, I think, the division between post-colonial and what does post-colonial political economy look like?
Particularly the work on Great Divergence,
Divergence. Yeah, that I don't know, and I can't really comment on that.
Yeah, but the other question you can always relate to, like post-colonial moment of political economy. Yeah.
Yeah. So I feel, and I think this is similar to the kind of response that I gave earlier. One way to think of it is during colonial time, or the history that was written at that time, there was a certain standpoint in which it was written. There are ideas scattering about, there is a certain kind of Eurocentrism that is there in the work of, and I mentioned this in my preface, that all of them are in a way Eurocentric. So, but what is it that they offer, which I think is relevant today to make sense of the surroundings? And The other way to think of it is when the governments today across think of reforms, think of market reforms, they always have this ideal in mind that a market economy is somehow better, or capitalism is somehow better, capitalism of a particular kind is always better. So my own way has been trying to understand, even in the best level, what can this model do? And there I feel that marginalist economics is not able to provide an answer, whereas political economy is able to provide an answer. And the answer it provides is that even at the best, under conditions of competition, markets cannot ensure full employment, markets cannot ensure fair wages, markets cannot ensure inclusive health, markets cannot ensure inclusive education. And once I think that recognition is there, then we need to seek the help of other social science disciplines to be able to together come up with an alternative. So I mean, and having said that, that way I believe my own position on what economics itself can do is quite limited. The scope of economics, I believe, has to be limited, and we should open up more dialogue with other social sciences to be able to have a fuller and a richer understanding of our surroundings.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. So also history has limitations, also economics, it has to be interdisciplinary kind of transdisciplinary dialogue, Thank you very much for this, very enlightening and very powerful string of thoughts that came up in this morning, which ignites definitely the minds and the sensibilities of all of us. So Rudra, over to you now.
Thank you, Professor Alex and Professor Nanda. Now I would like to request Dr. Kamal Prasad Mahanti to go for a formal vote of thanks. Dr. Kamal Prasad Mahanti.
Good afternoon, one and all present here in this wonderful afternoon. Really, I'm privileged to take this golden opportunity to thank each of us. At the outset, I would like to convey my sincere thanks and gratitude to Professor Alex Thomas for his kind presence and thought-provoking talk. On behalf of Center of Adivasi Research and Development, Odisha, and IIM Sambalpur and Central University, Odisha, I again, sir, convey my sincere thanks to you. I would also like to thank Professor Mahadev Jaiswal, Honorable Director, IIM Sambalpur, and Professor I. Ramabrahman, Honorable Vice Chancellor, Central University, Odisha, for their kind support and guidance to conduct this dialogue smoothly. My heartfelt thanks to Professor Chandi Prasad Nanda, sir, and Professor Charudatta Panigrahi, sir, for their continuous support and guidance to make this program more meaningful. I would also like to thank Dr. Bikram Kesari Jana, respected Director, Center for Adivasi Research and Development, CARD Odisha, for his initiative to arrange this program from local to global. I would also like to thank all the key persons behind this scene, Dr. Samuel Lima, Subham Das, Ghanshyam Giri, Rudranarayan Das, Chinmay Sahu, for their continuous support. Lastly, I would like to convey my thanks to all academicians, policymakers, stakeholders, research scholars, students, and print and electronic media friends, those who are present here, for their kind presence and participation, without whom we cannot make this program more lively and vibrant. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Jai Hind.
Thank you.